All right, so we are continuing with our factoring notes. So we have our factor squares, which are in our notebooks. We have our notes over prime factorization of a monomial. And today we are going on to greatest common factor. And that is abbreviated GCF. And so, excuse me, we are going to be using our factor squares that are really going to help us out to figure out the GCF of different monomials. So I'm going to turn to page 96. Here it is. And we are going to get started. Greatest common factor. All right, so greatest common factor, again, we talked about just in our labeling of this page, is that it's also known as GCF. And greatest common factor is the greatest or biggest, right? If we're going to go non-mathematical term, number we'll say all, because it might be 2 monomials, it might be 3 monomials, it might be 4 eventually. So all monomials, or we'll even say terms, can be divided by. So, greatest common factor, GCF, is the largest, the greatest, the biggest number that all the monomials, or all of the terms, if it ends up being a polynomial, can be divided by. So we're going to first talk about it without factor squares. So let's go without factor squares. So you're not always going to have your factor squares with you, right? If you're, taking the MAP test next year, you're not going to have that factor squares with you. So this is how you would find your greatest common factor. If we had, let's go 12x y squared and 40x squared y. So without factor squares, we are going to do the prime factorization. So we're going to factor both of these monomials. So if I was going to factor 12, I would do 2 and 6. 2 is prime, and 6 is 2 and 3. And 2 and 3 are both prime. So my factorization for 12x y squared would be 2 times 2 times 3. 1, 2, 3, right? Those are my 3 terms. And then I do x, y, y. If I was going to factor 40x squared y, I'd have 4 and 10. I'd have 2 and 2. And 2 and 5. So the prime factorization of 40x squared y would be 2 times 2 times 2 times 5 times x times y. And so now my GCF, my greatest common factor, I'm going to look to see what they share. And let's see if I have a highlighter here. So what do they share? Well, they share a 2. They share another 2. They share an x. And they share a y. So the greatest common factor, and let's go over here in our notes, the GCF is what they share. So my GCF is 2 times 2 times x times y, which is 4xy. So again, if you don't have your factor squares with you, right, you're doing something where the factor squares aren't allowed, which factor squares are allowed right now. But if you don't have your factor squares, you do the prime factorization of your monomials, of your terms, and you look to see what do they share. So these share a 2, an x, and a y. So now let's go with factor squares. So let's go through and use our factor squares. So I have my factor squares back here. Okay. I will also upload a PDF of factor squares so that you can look at that too. But it's really helpful to have this with you in your notebook. So to use my factor squares, and let's go big. Let's go 3 terms. So 36 x squared y to the 4th. Let's go 12 x to the 3rd y squared. And let's go 42 x squared y to the 5th. Right, so I could factor these. I could, if I didn't want to use my factor squares, I could do the prime factorization and look to see what they share. Or I can go in here and I can find these 3 coefficients. So I'm going to go 36, 12, and 42. So I'm looking at 36, 42, and where am I going? 12. So I'm looking to see what factors, what numbers inside those boxes, what's the biggest number that they all share. So I'm going to go with 12 just because it has the fewest number of factors in the square. And I'm going to pick the biggest number and see, do they all share? So I'm going to go with 12 first. 36 can be divided by 12, so maybe that's it. Let's go to 42. Can 42 be divided by 12? No. So now I'm going to go down to 6. 12 can be divided by 6. Can 36 be divided by 6? Yes. And can 42 be divided by 6? Yes. So the greatest common factor that they all share, the biggest number that is in all 3 of these boxes, is 6. So my GCF is 6. I have x squared, I have x to the 3rd, and I have x squared. So the biggest number of x's that they both share are x squared. And I have y to the 4th, y squared, and y to the 5th. The biggest exponent for y, the most y's that they share, is y squared. So my GCF of 36 x squared y to the 4th, 12 x to the 3rd y squared, and 42 x squared y to the 5th is 6 x squared y squared. All right, let's try another one. Let's try 14 a to the 3rd b to the 4th and 56 a b squared. All right, so I'm going to look at my numbers, my coefficients, 14 and 56. And I'm going to go to my factor squares for 14 and 56. If you didn't have your factor squares, you could factor each one of these and see what matches. If I go back here to 56 and 14, they both share 7. Right off the bat, I can see that. However, that's not the biggest number that they both share. You cannot forget that the number is divisible by itself. So 14 can be divided by 14. Can 56 be divided by 14? Yes. So the greatest common factor, the GCF that these both have, is 14. How many A's do they share? Well, there's 3 here and there's 1 here, so they share 1 A total, right? There's more over here, but you can only go with your shared value. And how many B's do they share? Well, there's 4 in this term and 2 in this term, so they share a total of 2. And if I did 30, let's go MT and 77 RY, I'm going to look and see what they share. So I have 30 and 77. So I'm going to look at my factor squares for 30 and 77. 77 and 30. Well, I'm going to go with 77 because there are fewer factors in this square, so 30 can't be divided by 77. 11, can 30 be divided by 11? No. Can 30 be divided by 7? No. So the greatest common factor for 30 and 77 is 1. The largest number that they can both be divided by is 1. Do they share any variables? They don't even share variables, so my final answer is the greatest common factor is 1. It's the largest number that both can be divided by. So you're going to use these notes to walk you through the greatest common factor homework. Factor squares are going to be really important to help you determine the greatest common factor for the coefficient. When you go into the variables, right? The variables, you're going to have to look to see, it's kind of counterintuitive, the opposite. You're looking to see the smallest exponent variable. The variable with the smallest exponent, that's the greatest number that they share. So you have to kind of switch your brain going back and forth, because if you wrote this out, you're looking for what they share. And this has 2 x's, this has 3 x's, and this has 2 x's. So at most, they can only share 2 x's, so x squared.